former Governor Huntsman. So I'll just give a little overview. You know, I worked with him back on his first campaign very, very long ago now, and then in the office. And one thing that I think always blew me away was just how smart he is. Like, we would have staff meetings and they would, you know, we would start with things that had to do with the office. And then they would somehow turn into this magical history lesson. And I never understood how he kept as much as he did in his brain, and I still will never understand it. But those were always really fun, whether they were really interesting that way, or do you remember the time they brought in the guy in a gorilla suit wearing a bikini to do the hula and sing me happy birthday? That staff meeting, that was really weird. So good times that we had. And now I'll turn the time over to you to give some remarks, and then we can get to questions.
Well, thanks, Bahar. That's very kind of you. That's overly generous, particularly your recollection of the gorilla who invaded our campaign office. One of the things we're missing is you in this campaign cycle. So I'm glad to be able to reconnect and to see how well you're doing. And the fact that you're bringing some of your customers, friends, and clients together is awesome. Jon Huntsman's my name, running for governor again. People say, why? You must be totally nuts. And I say, well, anybody who runs for public office these days has probably got to be a little bit nuts, because most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I think I'll run for public office. Because you take a lot of slings and arrows, you take a lot of criticism, you take a lot of grief. And listen, believe me, there are other things I could be doing in life. And I think the most important thing, and the one thing that we'll all be measured by, is what we do for others and how we serve our communities. And my sons, who went to the U.S. Naval Academy, they're both active duty naval officers right now. When they were plebes, lower than dirt at the Naval Academy, they had to memorize a saying by Theodore Roosevelt called "Man of the Arena." And this is something that's been part of our lives for quite some time. And that is, you have a choice in life. We all do. You either can be in the arena and try to affect change to the best of your ability and be willing to stand up to criticism or whatever else comes your way, or you can stand on the sidelines and you can be a critic. And as for us, the Huntsman family, which came into town in 1973, just as I was beginning high school, we had big dreams. We didn't have a corporation. We didn't have a cancer institute. We didn't have a Huntsman anything. And a lot of people hear the Huntsman name and they just think it's been around forever. Well, my relatives have been around forever, 7 generations, mostly in Millard County. But my dad, who passed on a couple of years ago, and a best friend, he had big dreams to build a business. And if we were successful, to give everything back. And if we were really lucky, maybe we would have the opportunity to serve. And that sense of service has really run through my generation and my kids' generation. And I hope that it always does, because I think it's a measure of who we are. So people say, what compels you? I say, well, a sense of service compels me, but here's what else compels me. I think we're at an historic point in this state where we either go big around what the state becomes, particularly after COVID-19, or we just sort of manage the status quo, which is what a lot of people are just content doing in politics. I'm not. And it's pretty simple. If you want status quo and caution, I'm not your guy. If you want to do something different, go big and take a risk, take a look and come join us. If we win, I think we can double the state's GDP. That's my goal. We have a GDP of 180 billion bucks right now. We ought to have a GDP of $500 billion. We're doing fine from an economic growth standpoint until COVID came along. Now we've got unemployment at 10% and rising, and that's going to continue. So even more to the point, the next governor is going to have to come up with a realistic economic plan that isn't just kind of reciting things that are not implementable. I've been governor. There's a lot of talk in politics, and a lot of things are not implementable. They sound great on the stump, but they're just not doable. So I'm trying to focus our campaign around things that are doable, things that are actually achievable. I'm running a high road campaign. I want to make sure that we end with respectability, win or lose. that we do it with the utmost integrity and sense of ethics. That's important to me. I think it's important to a lot of people in this state, and that we do it based upon putting forward realistic ideas. And we can talk about some of those ideas maybe in a minute. But for those of you who are registered to vote, the Republican primary is coming up. It's days away when people start voting. They start voting on June 9th. And the last day to register is June 19th. And that will play out until June 30th, and that will be it. That'll be the end. And then you'll have somebody who will win the Republican primary. And that, based upon the state's demographics, will be the next governor. It's pretty simple. So we've been in this to stay. It's been tough with COVID-19. You're not able to get around and see people face to face, eyeball to eyeball, which is what I prefer doing, because that's what makes politics great. And it's what makes it so unique in this state, in this country. So my focus will be on getting us out of the hole economically, because I learned as governor before, if you can make the economy work, everything looks pretty good and you can pay the bills. If you fail on the economic front, nothing works very well. You're going to lag on jobs. You're going to lag on median incomes that are achievable. You're going to lag on your ability to fund education and transportation and human services, which are the biggest parts of the budget, which is now $20 billion in size in this state. So for those of you who would like to get to know our campaign, go to huntsman2020.com, take a look at what we put out in terms of an economic development plan. Just as importantly, take a look at what we've done before, because there's a lot of talk in politics. I have a track record, and some people will like it, some people won't. And some people will agree with you, but never 100% of the time. So take a look at what we did last time on the economy. Take a look at what Bahar allowed us to do once we won the election, and we're able to break loose with the 10-point plan, every one of which we implemented, from rebranding the state, Life Elevated, to the tax policy that we still have today, to the Governor's Office of Economic Development, to the World Trade Center, to the 7-cluster economic development strategy. The list goes on and on and on. We planted those seeds, and they were very, very important and critical to economic growth that followed on. I believe that real ideas matter, and real ideas that take root and that people can get around and support, they make states succeed. And there are a lot of states that aren't succeeding, and there are a lot of states that are probably going to be in a really tough set of circumstances post-COVID-19. And it's for that reason that I think starting, this next year, going into next year, we're going to see the largest movement of labor and capital and manufacturing that this world has seen since World War II. And we're either in a position to make it work for our state, or we lose to somebody else. And they get it, and their state benefits. Their educational systems benefit. They're able to do more. So I want to be in the fight. I want to be able to have a plan that recognizes that we're facing a transformational moment. This is just not an average year. These are just not average events and circumstances that we're dealing with. These are absolutely once per century deals. And it's going to disrupt the world as we know it. And it's going to disrupt the country. And I don't see it from a fear standpoint. I see it from an opportunity standpoint. And if we're able to harness some of these opportunities in our favor, understanding what lies ahead and able to plan for it in advance, I think we're going to do not just great. I think we're going to excel beyond what anyone thought the state was possible of. So that's where I'm coming from. I'll look forward, Bahar, to any questions you have and to taking the conversation in whatever direction you like. But let me just say what an honor it is to be with all of you who are entrepreneurs and innovators and risk takers. And I think that's awesome, because you make the marketplace work. And without you, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because we'd have no tax base. So my appreciation to all of you for what you do.
Definitely, and thank you. And I completely agree. This is a fantastic group of people we have on the call. I'm a big fan of all of them. So I'm going to go through some of these questions. I'm sure the first one that I'm giving you is one you answer all the time. It's the one that most people had asked. It's about COVID. So the question is, how do you feel the COVID response has been? What would you have done differently? And if there is another outbreak, what measures would you take to ensure public safety while also keeping businesses from shutting down again?
Well, we have to make sure that health is an important driver in all this, but just as importantly, we have to make sure that the economy isn't stifled. And I think we've stifled too much of our economy in the last little while. If there's a lesson that we should learn, it is, one, why do we politicize COVID-19? Why do we have task forces led by politicians as opposed to public health experts? And I say that because all you have to do is go back to 1969 and look at the Hong Kong flu, which hit the world, numbers that are pretty similar to what we're experiencing with COVID-19. We didn't have politicians who ran it. In fact, our president of the United States then, Lyndon Baines Johnson, got the Hong Kong flu, as did an astronaut in space who was part of the Apollo 8 mission. It was a much different approach. We didn't close down. We had Woodstock. I mean, things kind of continued. And so that's the other extreme. So I think we've gone in a direction that I'm not comfortable with. And I think, we need to identify the at-risk population. And it's pretty clear based upon what the patterns of the deceased has been, that it's over a certain age, pre-existing conditions, a lot who have sadly passed in long-term care facilities and retirement centers. Not all, but I would say the majority. We're not New York City, and every time people stand up and try to do the same thing here that they're doing in New York City, it just doesn't fly with me. We're much different, and we have an urban component, we have a rural component. And I would like to see us, if we were to experience this again, not to make it a political exercise. We should turn it over to the experts. If Dr. Dunn had been there telling us what she knows and what we ought to know as citizens and let us govern ourselves, I think that's probably the right step. But I think going forward, we need to realize that some segments of the population are way more at risk than others. And let's do our best to protect them. And let's let the rest of the population make decisions based on social distancing, based upon what the experts are telling us, to engage as they wish with the economy or other things. It's not a perfect solution, but I think we're in a deep hole. And I think it's deeper because we've turned out the lights in many cases. I look at what's happened in some businesses. You just take the restaurant and hospitality business. I mean, it's been devastated. And a lot of those jobs, as you know, some of you who are close to that industry, some of them aren't going to come back. And anyway, that's a long way of saying I tried to put forward a plan over 2 months ago that said, in a state with $1 billion rainy day fund, folks, it's raining outside. We have a Category 10 storm that's sitting right over us. And why we didn't take $300 million out of $1 billion rainy day fund and use it simply to encourage small businesses to keep people on payroll through the extension of working capital lines of credit. We can work out the details later, but the emergency is we've got to keep people on payroll, because once they're taken off, you all know the game changes. And we have people who then fall into despair. And we've got too much of that anyway, when we've got 2 suicides a day and 12 attempts in this state. So that I wanted that done. I wanted the banking sector to step up, which basically gets free cost of capital from the Fed window, to do more from their end as well. The federal dollars are supposed to come in. They were supposed to come in. But listen, anyone could have told you, has had any federal experience, it's going to be way delayed. It's going to be way harder than you think. People who hope to get money are not going to get it, and it's just not going to work the way it should. And so having the state as a first responder to carry us for whatever period of time, knowing this isn't going to last forever, I thought was the right step. And others are in a position to make those decisions, and they have. But if we were not to use this, Bahar, as a learning experience going forward, if we get hit again in the fall, or heaven forbid we get a second round of pandemics in the next year or two, then we haven't done what you should do during a time of crisis, and that's use it as a learning opportunity.
Definitely, and thank you. And you actually answered a couple other questions people had through that answer, so that was fantastic. Another one to COVID that was kind of touched on a little bit is from Steve Boulay at Magic Space Entertainment. He says that live entertainment, specifically, touring Broadway, symphony, ballet, operas, and concerts are being crushed by this crisis. How would you suggest the state government help them so they can reopen in 2021 and even survive until they get to the opportunity to reopen?
Well, again, there's always going to be the back and forth about health versus the economy. And I don't know, maybe I push the envelope too much, but I'm also more of a realist about how deep this can cut on the economic side. I was just down in Tuacahn in St. George last week, and here we have this beautiful venue, and it's sitting dormant. Nothing's happening. And some of it is because many of the performers and the artistic talent, based upon their relationships, are not allowed to do it right now. And I said, well, what about local talent? What about local musicians? What about local performers? What about social distancing in this 2,000-seat arena? What about doing something that allows us to keep the lights on? What about live streaming? I think there are things that we can do that ought to be done more immediately in terms of allowing people access to real entertainment. I think that's missed. That's a big part of our culture, and I think it's missed right now. I'd like to see us think a little more creatively about how we can make that happen. No easy answers, obviously, but I think we're only limited by our ability to think creatively about how we can make some of these events happen.
Definitely. Thank you. All right, the next question comes from Aaron Allen over at Mountain Alarm. He says, over the past few years, the biggest concern as a company has been the legislature's push for taxing services, which significantly impacts their customers and their industry. Based on your prior experience, what strategy would you take to solve our tax dilemma and surpluses that are being presented by our current leaders?
Well, we're in a much different environment right now than we were pre-COVID in terms of budget and revenue. I did tax reform. I led tax reform a decade ago, and we delivered the first flat tax in the history of the United States. It took us 2 years to get it done. In fact, longer than that. I mean, Bahar, you'll remember that effort. And we took the sales tax off food almost in its entirety. We delivered a flat tax of just about 5%, just a little bit under. We double weighted the business tax, and we did a few other things that were really important. So I'm not one who believes that the government should be picking winners on taxation. And the last go around, which fell flat late last year, I think was a result of a couple of things. One, you just don't lead with the idea that you're going to raise the tax on food. I think that's a non-starter, and I thought that was a bad idea. That you can make the economic argument, but I think there's a moral argument to be made as well on the food tax. And some people disagree with that, some agree. But I think what really was lacking was the time it takes to bring the public into it, to apply transparency, to bring special interest groups, members of the legislature, all of whom want to know what's going on and they want to weigh in. They want to be part of what the ultimate solution is. And I think that's why we got 100% of the vote in the legislature when we did tax reform. We got every Republican, every Democrat. It took a long time and it was arduous and painful. We never thought we'd get to the end point, but I learned a very important lesson through all of that. I think everybody did. And that is tax reform is never easy. It's one of the most complicated things you can do in the arena of public policy. And it must be done bringing the public along because they're directly impacted by it. I think our income tax is competitive. I think our business tax is in the universe of being competitive. Our sales tax, because of the way we're buying things, and more the services sector is a part of our overall economic participation. That's going to have to be looked at some point. It's going to have to be looked at very carefully, because I just don't buy the idea that we can pick winners and just name a couple of businesses and put the burden on them. So the debate should start. The analysis should begin. And why do we do all of this? We do all of this because we've got to pay the bills. And you've got to have enough revenue, basically, to pay for education and transportation and human services, which are really the three big ones. So I don't have any immediate solutions on what the services sector would experience going forward on taxes. But I can tell you that that's the one area we're going to have to look at and do something about longer term, because that has diminishing returns just as our economy changes over time.
Definitely. Thank you very much. The next comes from Todd Bailey, who's the executive director at Mountain Lands CHC. He said there have been many studies that indicate one of the top reasons people file for bankruptcy is medical expenses. However, many people procrastinate or delay the needed health treatments because they can't afford it. What role do you think state government should have in this? And how do you think community health centers could be or should be involved in this response?
Todd's question is a very good one, and it's so multifaceted. We could spend, hours on it. So you have the physical health side, and we're sometimes not even thinking about the mental health side. So why do I say mental health? Because it's a huge issue in the state right now. Our suicide rate among the 10 to 25-year-old cohort is the leading cause of death. Leading cause of death. So we have become the buckle of the suicide belt of our country. And we're just too good as a state and too good as people to let that define us. So what should our goal be there? And then we'll get into some of the other aspects. Our goal needs to be to figure out why mental health lags in terms of insurance coverage, access, and services, lags physical health. So when we go in to have, routine stuff done from a physical health standpoint, you've got insurance mostly to cover it. You've got access to clinics and professionals who can basically care for you. On the mental health side, with mental illness, you don't. We don't have any of the above. We have some, but our infrastructure is lacking. I don't think we've done any planning as it relates to how many psychiatrists do we need longer term? How many health practitioners do we need longer term? So this is a personal issue for me because my sister died of a drug overdose, and it was preceded by mental illness. Everybody recognized, but you know what? We never talked about it. In fact, we just marked the 10th anniversary of her passing. And it's just been recently that our family's been willing to talk about it. There was no one around to demystify it. There was no one around to say there are services available. There was no one around to say maybe you should do this or that, as if you had broken a leg or something. A completely different category. So I don't think we should rest until we're able to make mental health at even parity with physical health in terms of insurance coverage, in terms of access to professionals who can help, because I think that's how important it is for the state right now. On the physical health side, what the state can do. I started this as governor before, and I think it needs to be picked up. Transparency in medicine is a really important concept, but it's not often used, and a lot of it's because providers and pharmaceutical companies and the healthcare industry largely does not want to do it. So when was the last time you went into a doctor's office or a clinic and you were given a menu of what you needed to have done to you along with costs, what it would cost, and options? And maybe there are less expensive options. Maybe there are other clinics or outlets that can perform a service, a routine CAT scan or an X-ray if you don't need a CAT scan, where the costs are $150 versus $1,500. So transparency in healthcare, I think, is one area that I'd love to see the state lead out on. So when you go into the doctor, the clinic, you basically know what you're signing up for and what you're paying for. So I think that's something the state could and should do, and we should be a leader in healthcare transparency. The other is the insurance sector is run by the state. So the insurance commissioner is a state undertaking. It isn't a federal. It isn't a federal responsibility. And as such, we ought to have more in the way of affordable and accessible insurance policies. And I know the industry does not always like that, and they come kicking and screaming, but we should not rest until we've got more in the way of healthcare insurance policies that are more tailored to how people live their lives. That can be done. It takes some creativity, and it might take the way insurance companies balance their risk portfolios. And that's not an easy thing to do. I understand, because I've tried that before. with insurance companies. When we got, as Bahar will remember, where we got one insurance policy, which was probably the first affordable policy in the state some years ago, mostly tailored for students, because our largest unemployed or uninsured population is 18 to 35-year-olds. And that is, we're never going to die. Why do we need it? And even if we wanted it, we can't always afford it. So more has to be done in terms of making more insurance policies available. I think if we combine transparency and upping our awareness in terms of what healthcare costs and our choices within healthcare with better insurance policies, I think we're going to be a much better place.
Fantastic. And again, you managed to answer a couple other questions that were on my healthcare and mental health sheet. So nicely done.
Efficiency, Bahar. That's called efficiency.
I appreciate it. It's fantastic. The next comes from Jen. She's the executive director at South Valley Services. They're a domestic violence shelter here in the Valley. She's wondering about affordable housing and homeless services. She said that the state said that they would fund more resources for affordable housing to reduce the people in shelters. However, they have not done this, resulting in fewer beds and more expensive resource centers and not enough rental help. And South Valley actually lost their funding for homeless prevention funding, which is the same as, rent for people, due to the shifting of state needs to fund and maintain shelters instead of preventing people to even need to go in shelters to begin with. So how would you handle the affordable housing crisis and the impact it has on homeless services?
Well, we don't have enough affordable housing. We're about 45,000 units short. That's a big problem. And we have a homelessness issue as well. And changes were made to try to improve it. And so far as I can tell, not much has been done. And if you talk to the experts, they will say, first of all, we need some leadership on some of these issues, particularly the homelessness issue. And we need some consolidation within the many players who were participants, whether they are direct or indirect, as in the way of wraparound services like Catholic Community Services. We need to coordinate that better. We need to consolidate better. As it relates to housing, we just need more in the way of accessible, affordable housing. And I'm convinced that, downtown is not the only place to do that, that we're going to probably see more of that go up outside of town where you've got more affordable land. But I'd also like to see some people take advantage of land that isn't used efficiently in the downtown area. So let's just look at, our public schools and land that might be part of public schools. I'm right down next to West High School, and you've got some huge parking lots around West High School that's really under the control of public ed. That would be prime spots to put up affordable housing. There's one example in Virginia of VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars outpost, that was not utilized, yet it was on a good piece of land in an urban area. And they put up affordable housing through a cooperative venture. And guess what? Veterans got housing out of the deal, and so did a whole lot more. So are we maximizing the space that we do have? And I know golfers don't like me to say this, but we got a lot of golf courses, in the metropolitan area. Are we using all of them? Well, if not, why don't we look at using some of that space? These are perfect areas for us to put up public-private kinds of cooperative ventures on affordable housing. And let's not just put up affordable housing, let's have a view toward ownership. Because one thing that's changed in the last 10 to 15 years is nobody wants to own anymore, everybody wants to rent. Yet one of the best things we can do is to work toward ownership, because that, I think, provides more stability overall within our community and with individuals and families. So why not put up some affordable housing that actually has some incentives that move people toward ownership as opposed to just renting? So you can think about getting 2 or 3 things done when you talk about affordable housing. Mostly, we need to start aligning economic development with housing opportunities. So we have 100,000 people who leave Davis and Weber counties, and they're outbound in cars going to work in Salt Lake and Utah counties. So we haven't done a very good job aligning economic development opportunities with where people live. And increasingly, we need to align those economic development opportunities, in other words, where we grow jobs, with where housing is going to be more affordable. And that's probably going to be not front and center on the Wasatch Front, but in the areas that will be part of our future growth.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, the next one, and I know you get this one a lot too, comes from John Butterfield, who's the president over at Jordan Valley Medical. Says, when discussing your candidacy with colleagues, I have repeatedly heard the criticism that you left the governor's office for a better opportunity. Although there isn't criticism of the decision, several have commented that you have had your time in the governor's office and it's time for new blood and new ideas. Why are you the best candidate, and why do you deserve a second opportunity to serve as our governor?
Well, it's a good question, John. And saying that going to China is a better opportunity is ludicrous. It's like saying going to Russia is a better opportunity. You know, I went because the president asked me to. It was the hardest decision I ever made. And again, it goes right back to that notion of service. What do you do when, you know, you're asked to do something? It's Mike Leavitt did it when he was governor. He went on to run Health and Human Services. Governor Dern did it to become Secretary of War. In earlier days. These things happen from time to time, and nobody will ever know the gut-wrenching discussions and ultimately the decision that comes out of something like that. So you need to put it in proper perspective. Our federal service is done. We've had the good fortune of serving our country and serving our state, and the greatest opportunity of our lives has been serving the people of this state. Now, when it comes to choosing a candidate, that's going to be up to the voters. And the voters, I hope, in this post-COVID environment in particular, are going to say, what can we find in the way of real experience with a network of relationships and connections to make sure that we navigate the road ahead? Because this is not just an average time where you're having an election and looking for a new governor. This is an extraordinary time that carries the potential for huge opportunity, but also huge pitfalls. And all I can offer is our track record. I'm not a politician as much as I am a public servant. And if people look at our track record, some will like it, others will critique it. But you know what? When you're in the arena, that's fair game. And that's what happens. And then the voters will decide. In a few short weeks, the voters are going to decide, and that will be the election in June. That's why I say voter registration is really important, because turning out and voting in June is the election. It's not November. It's going to be June, and the stakes are pretty high. So I invite voters to take a look at where we've been and what we've done, things they will agree with, and some things that they won't agree with, because you're never going to get a perfect candidate who's able to check all the boxes. So you can try something new, and people talk about that, and that's always going to be a consideration. But I would submit to you that I think this is a time where experience and time in a chief executive seat is going to be to the advantage of the state.
Fantastic. All right, Dan Adams, the executive director of the Utah Center for Neighborhood Stabilization, said at the conclusion of McCain's presidential run, you said, "We're fundamentally staring down a demographic shift that we've never seen before in America." Can you please elaborate and share what demographic shifts you are observing in Utah and how they will affect our future?
Well, we're seeing a couple, and maybe more than that, but just a couple that come to mind when it comes to demographic shifts. We're seeing the influx of new people coming into our state. When you look at adding another 1 million people to our state in the next 10 years and doubling the state's population by 2050, that's an influx of folks who weren't here. But I'd say at least half of those numbers are those born within the state. We have big families, and 7 kids guilty as charged. And so that will present a unique demographic change. And I would say that in the post-COVID-19 environment, the numbers that we were looking at before all of this happened are probably way low compared to what we're going to get. Because I think there's going to be a real flight to safety and safe haven places with a good quality of life. So that demographic is going to change. The voter demographic is changing as well. So what is the fastest growing party in our state? I would say the unaffiliated party, if you look at the numbers. So Republicans, which I've been my whole life, it would number probably 650,000. Unaffiliated, probably moving beyond 500,000. Democrats are probably 200 to 250,000. So the shift that's taking place is not just in terms of people's point of origin and the ethnic mix and the diversity that the movement of people will bring, but people are affiliating differently or not affiliating at all when it comes to politics. And that was the point that as I recall, I was mostly making reference to after John McCain lost, which is how do you win an election while appealing to your political base based upon your party affiliation, but how do you bring more people in as well? Because that's how political elections are won these days more than ever before.
Fantastic. All right, Katie and Jeremy Nelson with Assure. And you remember Jeremy from back the Fund of Funds days.
Yeah, Jeremy, great.
Hey, Governor.
So they asked, they said that Utah has one of the most vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems, but Utah's Securities Division hasn't adopted the NASAA model rule, which would allow for investors to invest in startups without the owner's compliance requirements. What plans may you have to bring Utah's Security Division forward and foster and encourage investment into Utah-based businesses?
Jeremy, let's talk about that. I mean, seriously, these are the kinds of things that are impediments to business expansion. So if and when elected governor, one of the most important things we'll do is identify, the top 100 barriers to business startup and business success. They're regulatory issues, they're changes in the law, but they're there. And a lot of cobwebs get built up in the attic when nothing is done over a long period of time. And I would submit to you that issues like this need to be looked at, and regulatory issues that have hindered businesses and that are just nonsensical need to be struck down. If we find things in the top 100 that nobody can explain why it is there, it should go. And if somebody can't explain why it's there, then it darn well better be a good explanation that serves the interest of the people. Otherwise, so let's just say, over the last 10 years, we've had 5,000 additional regulations and laws that have been put on the books. So at some point, you got to call a timeout and say, well, what does all this mean? How much of it is actually usable as opposed to just sort of clutter that gets in the way? So for every new regulation we put up, we ought to take 2 down. That should be a good discipline that we go by. The financial sector, Jeremy, is a really important one. And if you go look at our economic development plan, you'll find that we have 3 sectors that I think will allow us to double the state's GDP from $180 billion to $500 billion. One of them is fintech and financial services, and that's to be able to take what today is, a relatively strong financial services sector with not a whole lot of fintech. I think we could use a whole lot more fintech. And I was just talking to somebody the hour before who's an expert at this, who thinks, we could attract some fintech opportunities from out of the Bay Area, which is where they're all congregated, and they're looking for someplace else to go. That could help us in creating an industry ecosystem that would have average salaries that are more 80,000 per year as opposed to 60,000 per year that we find in other industries. And it would allow us to do not just traditional banking, but advisory services, accounting, insurance, and ultimately even have many IPOs when companies are ready to go public. That's the kind of financial infrastructure that I think we need. And you may be talking about something, Jeremy, that would be important in terms of loosening up one such sector for investment and participation that we might really need to look at. So I would see that as part of the broader strategy to really look at finance, to look at fintech, how it is connected to our universities and business schools, how it's connected to a very global population that we have here, in an industry that truly is global in nature and one that we should be host to.
Fantastic. And, you mentioned some of the cobwebs on things, and it kind of goes to another question that they had over there. And it was, do you have any plans to revive the Utah Fund of Funds or USTAR to bring them to the original intent? It seems they are not quite being utilized the way that they were created.
Yeah. So these things were all born out of a vision for the state. And if a vision is lost, they're just going to fall by the wayside. And, not everybody shares the same vision. That's a given. Fund of Funds was there born out of a vision. We needed more capital. So I learned early in my own business career, but also in looking at why states are successful and why countries are successful economically. There are two things that they're able to bring together that, when done right, they are magical. One of them is you got to have brain power. You got to have that creative entrepreneurial capacity of risk takers who are willing to think big and pursue their dreams. And in combination with that, you have to have capital. You have to have money that flows into the marketplace. They've got to be funded. They have to have access to capital. If you've got one without the other, it's incomplete, and it will not work for you. And the entrepreneurs will ultimately find a market somewhere else. They will leave you. And that was one of the biggest problems we had when I was elected governor, is we had too much of our brain power and talent that was migrating to neighboring states because they had more capital. So part of the Fund of Funds was born out of the idea that we have to attract capital, and we have to be creative about how we bring capital in. And, somebody was just telling me, I think earlier today, that, it's tens of millions of dollars the state benefits from the Fund of Funds. Well, why don't we double that? Why don't we look at building on the base that was started? It hasn't been done. I don't know why, but we got to look at upping our game. We had to look at upping our game in terms of bringing more venture capital and private equity into the state. Why does everybody have to have an outpost in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco? What about here? What about what our future looks like and our vision consists of in terms of real opportunities that people are going to want to take advantage of? So that's the Fund of Funds thing that, I just think we have to recognize has been good, was a good idea, and needs to be built on. The USTAR approach, that was done. This is a personal deal to me because, I was personally very invested in the whole concept. So economies work because economies, through freedom and innovation, generate new ideas. And those new ideas transform the world when it's done right. And in order to have new ideas, you have to have a very fertile environment for innovation and entrepreneurship. And USTAR was an approach that sought to bring in people who were leading thinkers in their field, leading innovators in engineering, in the sciences, in healthcare, that could be brought on to create new intellectual property and innovation that could then be taken out to the marketplace, because we just didn't have enough of that. And I looked at where other states were really succeeding: Austin, Texas, Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Boston corridor, Silicon Valley. And they had a lot of these innovators who were creating their own ecosystems with ideas that were completely unique in sectors that were ripe for development. And USTAR was really an effort to allow the state to break out of the box from a sheer innovation standpoint. And I think that needs to be reviewed and looked at again, because that whole power of innovation and the concept of creating new IP that then is taken out to the marketplace, that's still around, and people are going to benefit from that who do it right.
Fantastic. All right, John Butterfield of Jordan Valley Medical asked this, but I know it impacts a lot of people on this call. So his business in focus is on the west side of Salt Lake Valley. As governor, what would your top 3 priorities be to strengthen the west side of the valley for those who work and live there?
Education, economic development opportunities, and transportation. I say education because I see education as the one leavener in our state, regardless of where you come from, where you're born, what your means are, provides a conduit to success. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do, not just there, but everywhere. So that is, I think, a game changer for families and for cities and towns and for the entire state. And I say jobs because increasingly that's where jobs are going to go. They're going to move west, and they're going to move way west, probably into Tooele at some point when you look at the inland port. And that will be a big part of economic development strategy going forward. And I think it'll be a very, very exciting thing as we move more economic development to places beyond just the traditional centers of business. And transportation opportunities, because mobility is opportunity. And for people who cannot get around just in a car, to have access to transportation options that allow them to connect with opportunities, with people, to be inspired, to be educated, I think is really important. So those are three things just off the top of my mind that would be important to keep in mind.
Fantastic. All right, we're getting near the end. I have two more questions for you, because I know you have a 12 o'clock. The next one is about air quality. And Aaron Allen from Mountain Alarm submitted this one. He said one of his largest personal concerns is clean air during the winter. The Herbert administration has promised change, but as of January, we're still the 7th worst metro area in the United States. As unlikely our population will decrease over the next 4 years, what advanced measures would you push for to make a larger impact on air quality in Utah?
The most important things we can do is look at the sources of bad air. And I think it's been really instructive to see. So I come from really bad air. You live in China, and the AQI, the Air Quality Index, and PM 2.5 levels are off the charts bad. And I follow those numbers here just because I'm interested, having lived in the worst air quality in the world. And our air quality, depending upon winter or peak summer, falls somewhere between Iraq and Germany. Because you have ways of comparing and contrasting your own numbers with the rest of the world, which is kind of instructive. But what we've learned over the last 2 to 3 months is you take a lot of cars off the road, what happens? The air quality improves. Surprise, surprise. So as we move more and more toward electrification, which I think is one of the most exciting and promising aspects of our future. Listen, I served for years on the board of Ford Motor Company, which I think is one of the great companies in the world. And they make the best trucks in the world. They are increasingly going, and we spent a lot of money on this when I was on the board, on electrification. The Mustang is now electrified. The F-150 pickup truck in 2022 will be electrified. So this is going to transform the way that we get around, the options that are available, and what it's going to do to overall air quality. So that's one big category, because tailpipe emissions, particularly if you're not using Tier 3 gasoline, can have really a bad impact on air quality and pollutants. And then we ought to be doing things like looking at our building standards and building codes, because a certain percentage of it comes from old buildings that seep and that are contributors as well. Front Runner, we just don't think about this sometimes, but Front Runner is using the oldest diesel engines, Tier 1, that are around. At some point, we want to electrify Front Runner as we look at double tracking it from Ogden all the way down to the southern part of Utah County. That'll be an important step as well. And then making sure that all of our 5 refineries up north are blending Tier 3 gasoline. Will be really, really important. Right now, 3 of them are signed up. We don't have all 5. And the migration to Tier 3 gasoline, I think, will be a really important contributor as well. So those are all the big ones, but I don't think anything is going to have quite the impact that the type of cars we drive will have, and the kinds of buildings that we build. And buildings are getting better with each passing year. They're improving. And cars are improving a whole lot too, and migrating more and more toward electrification, which makes for a very exciting and promising future.
Thank you. So this will be the last question. I'll let you take it however you would like and go with it as long as you like, knowing you have a 12 o'clock. Lieutenant Governor Cox is a strong candidate for governor. How do you see yourself as being different, better, or a stronger candidate?
I'm not very good at comparing and contrasting people, and I would never be in that business. People can look to him and his track record and experience as a manager, as a leader, as somebody who understands issues that are important to them, and they can look at me, and they can look at Greg Hughes, and they can look at Thomas Wright, and they're all great people. And one thing that is unique about all of us is we're all crazy enough to get in the arena. I don't know any other way to describe it, because what is surprising in a lot of ways, and I don't know that a lot of people appreciate this, there aren't a whole lot of people who run for office. And we look at how much is dependent upon the vision and the decisions that are made, particularly in the governor's office, because they last maybe a quarter to half century. I mean, a governor does not do short-term stuff. It's all long-term. And they last a long time, but yet when you have the first open seat, which this is, in a very long time, you have a handful of people who run. And I look at that and I say, I've seen the Russian system, which is completely broken, under authoritarian control by the Putin regime, and people have no say. Nobody can stand up and run for office. It's impossible. You can, but you'll be taken out pretty fast. And I look at China, which is a quarter of the world's population. They have no such option. It's all run by the Communist Party and the people who have been elevated through that process. And here we have a system, representative democracy, that allows anyone really to stand up and say, I think I want to do it. I think I want to go for it. And you get a handful of people. That's all. I don't like that outcome. I think that says that we have a lot of people who are concerned about the issues, and many who complain and blog endlessly about them. But when it comes right down to it, they won't raise their hand and say, I'll give it a go. And I think we ought to have races where people are lined up, they're ready to start and roll up their sleeves and begin the discussion on the issues that matter most to them. That's what makes our system unique. That's what makes it function. We still rely on the vote and a winner coming out of that who will then lead out in certain areas. So I commend those that I'm running against. I really do. We're all different. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We all bring something quite unique and different to the table, and that's what the voters will look at. I'm not one who ever engages in negative campaigning. I think that's the worst thing in politics. I get a lot of it directed toward me, but I want to end this campaign as I started, focused on ideas, doable ideas, bringing people together, and running a high road campaign, because I want to end with a sense of dignity, whether you win or lose. Life's too short not to put things in proper perspective. I don't want to end having done negative stuff, because that just follows you around for the rest of your life. And as I say, life's too short. So I respect them all. I don't agree with all of them. We differ on the issues, and stylistically and experientially, we're very different. And I think that's where people are going to ultimately cast a vote. So I hope I didn't take that too long, Bahar.
No, you're the one that has the 12 o'clock, so you're totally good. If you're good, we're good.
I sure do. And I've really appreciated the time with you and with your colleagues, and I thank you for it. I thank you for your interest in the issues and for your interest in this race. It's, as I say, you have races and then you have races. And this is at a pivotal time in our state's history. And we'll look back on this decision and say, yeah, it's a decision that's going to last a very long time, because the decisions that will be made by this election decision will last a very long time and will be part of transforming and shaping our future and our landscape. So it's been a real honor and privilege to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for attending and submitting your questions. And I'll get those aquarium passes and coffee gift cards in the mail to everyone. And I hope to see you all in person very soon. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.